Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Ron Franscell, and he just published a book March 1st, 2022. Title of the book is ShadowMan, an elusive psycho killer and the birth of FBI profiling. Really an excellent read, fascinating book. He's a superb writer, and this is not his first book. He's written and is the author of 18 books, including the Edgar-nominated Morgue, A Life in Death, and the international bestseller, The Darkest Night, a true crime memoir hailed by Anne Rule and Vincent Bugliosi as a direct descendant of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, and listed by the New York Times as one of America's most powerful true crime books. His atmospheric and muscular writing has established him as one of the most provocative voices in narrative nonfiction. Ron grew up in Wyoming. He grew up in several newsrooms before hitting the road on one of American journalism's best beats, covering the evolution of the American West as a senior writer for the Denver Post. Shortly after 9/11, he was dispatched by the Post to cover the Middle East during the first few months of the Afghan War. In 2004, he covered the devastation of Hurricane Rita from inside the storm. He and his wife now live safely in northern New Mexico. His book reviews and essays have been widely published in many of America's biggest and best newspapers, such as the Washington Post, Chicago Sun-Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Denver Post, San Jose Mercury News, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and others. He has been a guest on CNN, Fox News, NPR, The Today Show, ABC News, and other major broadcast outlets all over America. And he appears regularly on crime documentaries at Investigation Discovery, History Channel, Reels, and A&E. And some of the titles, I'm not going to go through all of his 18 books, but some are Alice and Gerald, A Homicidal Love Story, Crime Buff's Guide to Outlaw Los Angeles, and I mentioned earlier, Morgue, A Life in Death, also The Darkest Night, Two Sisters, A Brutal Murder, and the Loss of Innocence in a Small Town, and also Angel Fire. And his website is his full name, ronfranscell.com. So www.ronfranscell.com. But again, we're going to talk about this book he just published, ShadowMan, an elusive psycho killer and the birth of FBI profiling. So, Ron Franscell, welcome to the show. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Welcome to me, to you. I'm just glad to be here. This is wonderful. All those credits that you read there, I hardly recognize. It's just fun to be here today.
Awesome. Well, you have a long writing career. You've written different books, reviews, essays. Can you maybe cover some of the earlier work you've done and what led you up to this book, ShadowMan?
I was a reporter for 30 years. In many ways, I still am. I just have sort of changed platforms a little bit. I'm no longer writing for newspapers, but writing book-length journalism in a sense. And there's a lot of difference there, but it kind of grows from that journalism experience. And like you pointed out, the high point probably is senior writer at the Denver Post, where I really got some experience writing these narrative nonfiction pieces where you're telling a totally true story, but you're doing it in a kind of story form. And you probably recognized that in ShadowMan, where I'm being a reporter. I'm telling all these facts, but I'm putting them in a form that we kind of recognize as being like a novel. It's like reading a mystery or a literary novel, because news stories start with the most important thing and then they trail off. Well, that would be a very short book. This is constructed in a different way. This is constructed as a story. So that, I think, is its appeal. And that really kind of comes from early on writing a couple of novels in my career, but then combining those tools from the novelist toolbox in my journalism. I'm not making stuff up. I'm just doing my reporting in a little bit different style that brings back the feeling that we're hearing a story.
Right. And this story does take place kind of closer to your original beat in Colorado, right?
Yes, and I grew up in Wyoming. I know the Upper Rockies. I know the people in the Upper Rockies, Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas. And that was part of its appeal to me, was that it was about places and people that I knew. But a big part of its appeal was simply in 50 years, nobody had ever written a book about this. Not the crimes, which are ghastly, but not the origin story of the FBI's profiling. So I was properly shocked by that, and I think at that point I decided I was going to write that book.
And this was, I mean, probably hopefully young kids are not listening to the show because it is ghastly, just like you said. I mean, some of these crimes are incredible, considering it's a small town, kind of mid or upper Rockies area. Can you kind of talk about some of the background of what really took place there in that kind of Manhattan area and some of the deaths?
Sure, we have over a period of time from 1967 through 1974, a number of crimes, deaths that happen. Not all are attributed to murder. The first two are attributed to some horseplay gone bad between a couple of preteen boys. Another one, just a stray shot from a target practice or a rabbit hunter. So nobody calculated those as murders. It's in 1973 that a little girl goes missing from a campground in Gallatin County, Montana. It's a remote campground near Manhattan, Montana. And when she goes missing, it's very quickly decided that this wasn't just a little girl wandered off. There was something more nefarious afoot. So the FBI was called in to take over the investigation as federal law demands. So uh, the FBI is there, but honestly, uh, what has happened here is a little girl is in a tent in this campground with three brothers and a sister. Um, Somebody cuts a neat half moon shape in the tent and pulls this little girl out in the middle of the night without disturbing her siblings, without her raising a ruckus, without any sense whatsoever that she's missing. That next morning, when they discover she's gone and they discover this hole in the tent, the only thing anybody sees is a faint trail off through the dewy grass. And even then, that disappears as the morning warms up. So, when the FBI arrives on the scene, uh, they have no real evidence, they have no witnesses. They have yet to hear any good leads or ideas. So obviously, they have no suspect. That's not unusual for the beginning of the first 24 hours of a crime. Uh, but this goes on for days, for weeks, for months, as the FBI is vigorously investigating this case. But 7 months later, they have no better idea about who this might be than they did on day one.
Right. So the girl never shows up. Susie Yeager, right?
Correct.
Gaegr. So they do everything. They search convicted sex criminals, hoaxers. They get scammed. There's no good suspects. So they're flummoxed. They can't figure out what happened. They never found her body, too, right? At least
Correct.
at that point, yeah. But then there was a call, too, right? At a certain point, somebody offered a ransom for her.
Yes, there was a ransom offered. There were a lot of calls, a lot of in the early 1970s, they had trolls too. They weren't
Right.
online, but they were the kinds of people, these hoaxers. Some of them wanted to get a cut of the ransom. Some were well-meaning but uh, troubled clairvoyants who believed they had seen in their visions certain clues. Uh, there were some people that just wanted to toy with a grieving family. So it was not uncommon for the phone to ring at Susie's parents' house in Michigan and it be somebody that was just toying with them. But one day, um, a phone rings and one of the brothers picks it up, and there's something about this one that seems uh, different. And so it's not recorded. He just recounts that this man had some information. They expected him to call back, and eventually he does. But it is those phone calls ultimately play a role in the creation of the profile some months later. But it's eerie, and very early they it's decided by the profiling, by the parents, by the bad guy himself, uh, giving information that this is the guy. This is the guy who took Susie, and that's where this starts to get more interesting.
Right. I mean, so that's it. There's something they know, or this caller knew specific to the girl, and that's really what it is. So for
Yeah.
some reason, had a compulsion to call the family. Right.
Well, yeah, he was a sadist, and that was something that was obvious even before they knew who it was. It was clear he had a sadistic streak a mile wide. He in those phone calls that we're talking about, he taunts the mother. He says things that are designed to put a knife in her heart and twist it. She's sickened by all this. She's grieving. She wants to fall down and cry, but she doesn't. She stands in there with him, asking questions and challenging him without being evil or mad. She's doing it as you might imagine a mother who's seeking her lost child, and ultimately uh, the profilers in this particular case see that he has a difficulty with that. Man, we might be getting ahead of ourselves there, but it's those phone calls are important. And in the end, I believe the mother is probably the hero of this story, not the profilers, not the FBI agents, but the mother who sort of brings this out.
Right. And so the mother's there, and then the agent is Dunbar, right, who worked the Susie Yeager case in 73, but then in 74, another person disappears, right? Sandy Smelligan?
Sandy Smalligan. She's a 19-year-old waitress in Manhattan, which is uh, 10 to 15 miles away from that campground. She disappears one night in February, and at this point, there's no thought. I don't believe it's on their radar at all that those two cases might be related. They're sort of being investigated on two separate tracks. There's no sense that that they have somebody committing these crimes. It's for all intents and purposes two different crimes
Right.
in their
Huge age difference, right? 7-year-old
and an age difference. 7-year-old girl and a 19-year-old young woman. And this is pre-serial killer. The term serial killer hasn't even been coined yet. And the whole idea of the serial part of serial killer was still forming. 19, it's kind of hard to believe that in 1974 we still weren't necessarily putting crimes together in linking them by the psychological similarities. That's developing. But there were no psychological similarities, no victimology similarities, no weapon, nothing. So the investigation for Sandy Smalligan to find her, it expands out from Little Manhattan to a remote, in ever widening circles, and one day, 10 days after she disappears, a couple of deputies are at a remote abandoned ranch in the middle of nowhere. They find her car hidden in this dilapidated barn out there. So the search switches to this abandoned ranch. And as they look closer over the grounds here, they eventually find just a large amount of crushed, pulverized, charred bones. So they collect what they can. They send it off to the Smithsonian, which gets back to them fairly quickly and says, indeed, these were the bones of a young woman, late teens, early 20s. And given the proximity of her car, they assume that this is what's left of Sandy Smalligan. But, says the Smithsonian, among these shards of bone are bones of a much younger female, under 10 years old. That's when the investigators put the two together. They believe that they are now holding some of the remains of both Sandy Smalligan, the waitress, and Susie Yeager, who had gone missing, 8 months before. The fact remained, though, that they still had no witnesses. They had no tips. They had no leads. They had no suspect.
Right. And they had the same FBI agent, though, Dunbar, who was very important to the story, right? Because as this is happening all the way across the country, Quantico and the FBI training academy has just been opened, right? Or had opened very recently.
Yeah, fairly recently before that. Dunbar had to go back to Quantico for some regular training and just scheduled training. And so while he's there, he attends a workshop. And this workshop is run by two FBI agents, one an expert in psychology, the other a very respected expert in crime scene analysis. They have gotten together and they have this theory that by looking at crime scene evidence, you could probably tell a lot about the behavior and the psychology of the perpetrator. They were developing that idea. It wasn't a popular idea. Boots on the ground law enforcement pushed back against the very idea, because they believed that the way you solve crimes is you talk to a lot of people, you knock on a lot of doors. Here were these guys saying, hey, we can read somebody's mind, in a sense. J. Edgar Hoover himself thought it was hokum. He didn't like the idea. He he was happy to have these guys teach separately psychology and crime scene analysis, but he didn't want them doing it together. But then J. Edgar Hoover dies, and there's a little more progressive leadership in the FBI that lets them have a little bit longer leash. And it's about that time that Dunbar hears their workshop. And here he is, frustrated by these entangled crimes against Sandy Smulligan and Susie Yeager, and he's flat-footed. And so he literally follows these two agents, Pat Mullaney and Howard Teeton, from the stage down to their offices in the basement of the training academy. And he tells them that what he's got and expresses his frustration. They think there might be something. It seemed like a kind of ordinary case of murder, if I can be so crass as to use that word. But they thought it might be a low risk way to test their theory. So they studied the case file and they issued their very first profile in this case. It told a lot about what they thought this particular perpetrator thinks and how he behaves.
And so they had a very detailed at that time, like 74, of who they thought who this person was. And it was interesting because you mentioned an earlier case that I had never heard of, which was fascinating, about the Mad Bomber of New York. That was amazing. That was Dr. Brussell.
Right.
Yeah, that was so. That guy was able. Dr. Brussell was able to describe the Mad Bomber to a T. Like he had specifics down that were incredible. So
yes,
the capacity really was. Sorry.
Absolutely, and I think it led to some of the suspicion about profiling because they were such wild outlines that he believed about the perpetrator of the bombings in New York in the 40s and 50s. But they were wild, and even today, knowing what we know about profiling, we can read the book about that and still be startled by some of the things he was coming up with. And I think that led to a certain amount of suspicion about the art and the science of profiling, even though they didn't call it that at the time, really. That was a term that Teeton and Mullaney kind of pulled out of their back pocket. They didn't know what to call it. So, look around and say, well, how about criminal profiling?
Right. I mean, it is fascinating. They had a lot of elements that were surprisingly similar to some of the stuff that come up. I mean, and it's interesting too, because a lot of people know the name Robert Ressler. So he worked under Mullaney and Teeton, right? So I've come across stuff with Ressler. Yeah, that was fascinating. So what happened next? What happened next after this profile?
Well, Teeton and Mullaney issue the profile. They give it to Dunbar, of course. It's about between 15 and 20 elements, ultimately. It starts at about 15. And they approach this purely on their experience and with logic. I think there's a little bit of it that was guesswork, educated guesses. But you got to remember that Teeton and Mullaney had no rule book. There was no system. There was no roadmap. They were separately experts in psychology and crime scenes, but they had no model on how those things might work together. Some things were based on what they knew, and some was just low-hanging fruit. A good example is, today, anybody who watches true crime TV assumes that the typical serial killer tends to be a white male in his 20s. But that's because we have 50 years of data. We have today's profilers have a database of thousands of intensive expert interviews with killers. Teton and Mulaney had visited with a few, and they had no database. In this particular case, when they said your likeliest perpetrator, your unknown subject or unsub, is likely a white male in his 20s, it's because these crimes required an astounding degree of stealth and strength that suggested he had military experience, which was largely male during those Vietnam years. His knowledge of the surroundings and the abilities of local law enforcement suggested he was local. And that being the case, in this rural Montana county, it's 99% white. So you can see how they're deducing along the way. In the end, they're correct. And in fact, of what is ultimately about 20 elements in the profile, they're right on 19 of them. And on the 20th, they're not wrong. We just don't know because, events made it impossible for us to know that particular answer. So they were astoundingly correct for their first time.
Right. So they knew he was an emotional crime, and they thought that the person would contact the family of Susie Yeager again. They predicted that. So they did something to elicit the perpetrator to call, right?
Well, and there are several calls in there, and they do say that. They say that this mentality has probably internalized this crime. He in fact has a kind of perverse familial relationship with the crime, that in fact he feels a part of the family in a sense, and that then he would probably celebrate a key moment the way you and I celebrate birthdays or anniversaries or something. So they warned Dunbar that on any of the particular anniversaries that were important to the crime, he would probably try to reach out. So they put a recorder on the family phone in Michigan, and sure enough, a year to the minute after Susie had disappeared, the phone rings in her parents' house, and just an appalling, fascinating conversation happens, during which the mother, as I said earlier, sort of stands in there with him long enough for the FBI to get a little bit better idea of the kind of person they were dealing with, and it helped improve the profile too.
Right, and he had a fairly long conversation with the mother, right? Just kind of badgering her, saying the daughter was still alive.
He was brainwashing her, and she was going to be re-educated to, liking him more than her family and trusting him more than her family, and so on. He was, like I said, he was thrusting a dagger into her heart and twisting it, and that was his intention. He wanted to crumple her, but she didn't.
Yeah, just a crazy psychological situation there. So once that phone call happened, what happened next?
Well, as I say, the profilers had some new information, and so they were getting smarter and smarter about this. Dunbar, who was from that particular part of Montana, he had worked as an agent in the big cities, but when his parents got ill, he asked to be transferred back to Montana. So he knows this place. Among the suspects in the case is a well, a very articulate, fairly bright I won't say ex-Marine, a Marine who was no longer serving, uh, who had no record whatsoever. The profilers were saying, you really need to look at this guy. He fits the profile, so to speak. Dunbar wasn't aboard with that. But he did his due diligence. He talked to the guy, and the guy just had no. He didn't sound like a killer. He didn't put off any vibe of being a killer. And Dunbar dismisses him fairly quickly. As they go, the profilers are still insistent that Dunbar should look at this guy. So he pops back up on the radar. They give him a lie detector test, which he passes with flying colors. They do it again a little bit later, and he passes. A third time, sort of at the insistence of the profilers, they give him a truth serum test, and he passes that with flying colors. In fact, Dunbar later talks about how his answers in the very first interview that he did were the same answers later in the truth serum, and there was no hint whatsoever that he was lying. So this particular suspect pops onto the FBI's radar about 3 or 4 times and pops off 3 or 4 times. It's one more phone call. It's 2 more phone calls that really bring the focus on him. And in the final one, again, to torture the mother, he claims that little Susie is with him, and he purportedly puts the phone up to the little girl, and she speaks and says, "Mommy, he's a very nice man," or something to that effect. At that moment, the FBI couldn't afford to be on the fence about this anymore, because if this guy that they were suspecting in a broad sense actually had another little girl, then they had to act fast. And that's when they swoop in and an arrest is made.
Right, and there were other, like, they didn't know there was Siobhan McGinnis too. Like, this was very strange things were happening prior to the arrest, right?
There were a lot of things, but none of them were ever really put together. None of these crimes was ever really considered possibly related to these crimes we're talking about. There's the disappearance of little Susie Yeager and the disappearance of Sandy Smulligan, which seem obviously related, but nobody was really looking at Siobhan and some other unsolved cases up to the
Michael
point.
Rainey, Bernie Pullman, right?
Right, Bernie Pullman, Michael Rainey, Siobhan McGinnis. There are a dozen unsolved murders in Montana at that time. He's arrested. He's the search happens, and in his possession, I don't want to put anybody off their feed here, but there's ghastly evidence found in his apartment. It's so ghastly. There's no question about his involvement. And his lawyer, who actually believed in him, who believed he was being harassed, goes to him in a rage and says, you're going to hang, which is Montana's method at the time.
And it is incredible that he fit the profile, but he definitely tried and kind of successfully outsmarted the authorities to a certain degree, right?
To a certain degree, almost completely. When you think about the passing all of the lie detection, but he had completely controlled them. I think at the moment when they slapped the cuffs on him, he lost a certain amount of that control. But when he then comes back to his lawyer and says, well, can we get the death penalty taken off the table if I give them more murders? That ultimately, that astounds nobody more than his own lawyer or Dunbar or the county prosecutor. But they do work it out that they will take the death penalty off the table if he will confess to the 2 more murders that he said he could. And he does, and that whole interview is put down word for word in this book, so that you can see the kind of conversation that was going on and the depths of his depravities. So that confession, they concentrate on getting his admission in these 4 cases. The 2 little boys we talked about earlier in 67 and 68, and then Susie Yeager and Sandra Smulligan, he confesses to killing all of them. So this interview is happening in the wee hours of early Sunday morning. He's arrested Friday afternoon. The dealing goes on Saturday, and then from about 2 to 4 a.m., Dunbar and the prosecutor are questioning him, getting these admissions. And it's clear from the transcript that they were very focused on those 4 things, and that their intention was to come back maybe even later that day, but over coming days, and interview him more about other cases, about these cases in more detail. And it's pretty obvious that was their plan. Without giving up too much, they are surprised about what happens next.
Right. I mean, it's really an incredible story and very disturbing. And this guy looked pretty clean cut. Like, that was another thing. Like, he was able to fool them all up until the end. So it's really, I mean, an elusive psycho killer is an apt description of this guy. I mean, really something else. And your writing is superb. You're an excellent writer. So it was really a pleasure to read through the book. So congratulations on that. Is there anything, I mean, we're at 40 minutes. I highly recommend people check out this book. There's an audio book too, so you can read through that if you're interested. Let's see. Yeah, the audio book's available, hardcover. Right now, it just got published. New release, already has 65-star ratings. So congratulations on that. Is there anything you'd like to add, Ron?
Yeah, only that I think that we start to see here, as the development of profiling, we begin what I think is a weird fascination with serial killers. It starts really kind of with Ted Bundy a few years later. But we also are learning, up to that point, I think people looked at deviant characters like this and thought of flying monkeys and boogeymen and even Charles Manson, that you could see them coming. But what we are beginning to understand with this case and then going forward is that no, they look like us. They live next door. They coach Little League. They go on vacation. We, I think, began to get that sense, and you see that in the profile. The other than some of the kind of deviant psychology they're talking about, a lot of the behaviors are ordinary things we do. So it's no longer, I don't think it ever was really possible to see evil coming
but this guy really was it. I mean, he was really, and you have it right there, kind of in the prologue too. You know, shadows come. So pretty dark. And your books are bestsellers like Darkest Night, Alice and Gerald. You have very great reviews. Clearly, people have read a lot of your other books. I was only aware of this one, but people can get all your books through your website, I assume, Ron Franscell.
Well, they can
Or
read
signed
about
copies?
them. Yeah, come to the website and read about them, but they're all available at any bookstore. If they're not on the shelf, they can certainly be ordered. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, you name it. Your local independent bookstore is a great place to buy books.
Excellent. And if people want to reach out to you, your website is RONFRANSCELL.com, right?
Correct. And
Awesome.
there's an email address in there that you can send me a note.
Cool. And I will put that website in the show notes. Again, the author's name is Ron Franscell. Title of the book we talked about today. Go get this book. Excellent book. Or listen to the audiobook. Title again is ShadowMan, an Elusive Psycho Killer and the Birth of FBI Profiling. And just published March 1st, 2022. So, Ron, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, William. It was a privilege to be here.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it. So have a great weekend. Stay there. Stay there.